It's Ken Collins from Skynet. In this video, I'm going to explain and walk through the security model in Cogent DataHub version 11. The UI and UX is significantly more complex than it was in previous versions, and the V11 security model introduces several new constructs. There are changes to authentication, including MFA support, and there are changes to authorization to provide more robust permission granularity. Even the security database file name has changed. In version 10, it was a file known as settings.sqlite. In version 11, it includes a database schema version number, and the file name is something like security v11.03.sqlite. When you run version 11 for the first time, the new security database file is created with default entries. V10 security data, like users and permissions, gets migrated, and this includes special OPC UA security rules. If you ever need to revert from version 11 back to the previous version, it's seamless because the version 10 security database file remains unchanged. That is, the security is the same as it was the last time version 10 was used. As far as the new constructs go, we have a user, which is the authentication element, essentially the identity to be validated during login. Principal is the authorization element, and it is associated with roles and permissions. During login, DataHub determines the effective permissions based on principal role membership. A permission set is an element that groups a set of permissions that are typically related. For example, the WebView design permission set includes all the permissions a user would normally need to connect, create a page, save a page, etc. Let's get started by working with the Cogent DataHub user interface. So let me just start by opening up Cogent DataHub. And the first thing that you'll notice is this security risk message, which is indicating right now that we're still using the default password, the admin password for the admin account. And this is an example of one of the security best practices that we want to handle. We'll come back to this later. For now, I'm simply going to acknowledge that I understand the risk, but we will change the password in a later video. When we navigate down to the security plugin and then click configure, we'll see the main security user interface. We were talking about the constructs that we rely upon in the new version 11 security model. So first and foremost, we have a user. A user is really the validated identity. That's the credential that is used during login. A principal is the authorization element, and it is what provides an association with role in order for us to get effective permissions. So during login, DataHub determines the effective permissions based on the principal role membership. And we'll see more examples of that later. Roles can be defined locally, or there are a number of roles that are already predefined related to the internal organization. So we can see, for example, basic connectivity and all data full access. We'll talk more about these later. Permission sets are a group or a set of permissions that are typically related. For example, WebView design includes all of the permissions that a user would typically need to connect, create a page, save a page while working with the WebView application. Going back to our specific user accounts, we see that, for example, if I look at the John user, we can see that the password authority listed here is what's known as built-in. Well, user accounts can have their password managed natively by the Cogent DataHub, and so those are considered built-in. And so the password during login is managed and validated by DataHub. These passwords are stored securely. They're encrypted and stored in the security V11 SQLite database. They cannot be unencrypted. It is impossible to recover a password from that database. On the other hand, we also have accounts like this one, which has been imported from an external LDAP server. And so the password authority for this type of account is Windows. Additional authentication factors can be added for any user account. So as an example here, when I look at the Sally user account, it is a built-in account within DataHub, and we've got a password, but we've also indicated that Sally requires TOTP authentication. And so we can just enable time-based one-time authentication passwords for any account by simply making that principal a member of the required TOTP authentication role. This requires pairing with an authenticator app like Microsoft Authenticator, and then when logging in, the user enters both his or her password suffixed with the one-time TOTP code. In a subsequent video, we'll configure an authenticator app to demonstrate how that actually happens. The new principal construct better addresses security best practices. And just to be clear, when we're talking about authentication, we use the user account as the main construct that is authenticated, whereas for authorization, we rely upon individual principals. That is, one user account can have multiple principals, and we differentiate these principals based on two different things. A connection source, for example, if we look at the John account, we can see there are different IP patterns for the different principals, and so that allows us to differentiate the connection source for example, a local host, a trusted network, or remotely via the internet. And so we use the IP pattern to differentiate those. We can also use a connection protocol or interface to differentiate accounts. So we can see here that these principals have different interface protocol expectations. And these can be anything from OPC UA, MQTT, TCP, etc. So a principal is a combination of a user account, an IP pattern, and an interface. When we look back at the John account, we can see that authenticating with John from IP address 12.34.111.001 can match a different principal than when John connects via an IP address of, say, 12.34.222.002. Those represent different IP patterns, and so those different IP addresses would result in connecting with different principals. And you can see when we look at the principal role membership for these accounts, that first account has John in the web view role with all data full access, whereas the second principal is in the using the role of WebView viewer and all data reader, so not full access. And we can see over here that as we change between those two accounts, we look at a different set of effective permissions for John. Similarly, for Sally, we can again see that when she connects via OPC UA, it's a different set of roles and therefore a different set of effective permissions than when she connects over TCP. By default, when we add a new user account, the default, just adding a password here, the default roles are basic connectivity and required TOTP authentication, and the IP pattern defaults to 0.0.0.0. These default roles can be adjusted in settings, and we'll talk a bit about that later. When we specify an IP pattern, we'll just go back and look at the John account again. We do so by specifying it using what's known as CIDR notation. And so in the case of Frank, for example, we can see that our new user account is virtually saying connecting via any interface and from any IP pattern. So the /0 represents the number of bits that the IP address must match the IP pattern. When we go back and look at the John account, for example, we can see that this account here, this principal here would match any IP address where the first 2 octets or first 16 bits are 111.222. We don't care about the third and fourth octet. It's this last number 16 that represents how many bits are relevant. In the previous IP pattern here, we can see that all 32 bits are relevant and compared, and therefore this principal would need to match exactly the IP address of 192.168.0.1. I mentioned the default membership for roles of basic connectivity and required TOTP authentication. Just in passing, I'll point that out here. We can see that the default principal for each new user is listed here: basic connectivity and required TOTP authentication. Those can be changed by the administrator. When we create a new principal, each principal is assigned to 0 or more roles. And so each role has a unique name and assigned permission sets, and effective permissions are determined by DataHub via the principal role membership, as we've discussed. The effective permissions as a debugging tool are listed over here on the right-hand side. And for the sake of, again, troubleshooting, we can look at any individual principal and we can look at all of the effective permissions that would be assigned to that principal when the user logs in, or if we wish, we can select an individual role and change that drop down to look at only the permissions that would be assigned based on the membership in that role. And so that makes it a little bit easier to identify where a particular permission might be coming from, whether it's from an individual role assignment or what permissions we can expect will be assigned to that principal when they log in from an IP address that matches that pattern using the particular protocol or interface. The role permission set can also be assigned a data domain pattern. And so when we look, for example, at the all data full access, let's just jump over to here to see that. I'm going to look at all data full access as a role. So there's all data full access. We can see that a member of this role would have full access to data from any domain pattern. That's what this regular expression of .* is indicating. Whereas if we look, for example, at this role here, we can see that this is not a regular expression match. This is an exact match on the data domain pattern. And so principals that are members of this role would have full access, but only to data domain patterns in DataPid and DataSim. In a subsequent video, we'll talk about how we can configure this with specific data domain pattern matching. Security constructs are owned by one of 2 organizations. We've got the internal organization and the local organization. The internal organization contains predefined roles, predefined users, and predefined permission sets. These are standard for all deployments, and they are not user editable. On the other hand, the local organization does not ship with any predefined permission sets or any predefined roles. It does ship with the admin role, but the idea is that constructs in the local organization are user defined. And so the expectation is that the DataHub administrator will add users and possibly roles and permission sets that they want to work with. But in adding a user-defined user account, they will then typically assign the principals the role membership based on the internal roles. If you want to allow a user specific access to or access to a specific data domain, you would create your own custom role, and then you would assign that principal into that custom or local role. And again, we'll see that in a separate video demonstration. So the internal user accounts, if we look back at these, are anonymous, DDE, mirror, MQTT, OPC, OPC-UA, and TCP. And these are the accounts that are used by DataHub when establishing connections with the various protocols before user authentication. They are internal use only and non-editable. The internal roles and permission sets, as I indicated, several predefined. They're there to facilitate administration for typical installations. When we add a local account, we have the choice of adding either a built-in account, which will be managed and authenticated by the DataHub. We can also use accounts that are imported from the local Windows machine or from an external LDAP server. When we're dealing with local built-in accounts, the administrator has the authority to invalidate a password or to set a password. When we are dealing with an account, for example, I've got one here that has been imported from an external LDAP server that is authenticated by Windows, either from a local Windows account or the LDAP server, and the password cannot be entered by the administrator, cannot be managed. Those are handled exclusively by the Windows environment. While we are editing in the native DataHub UI, we do see various things showing up in red, and those represent changes that have been made but have not yet been committed to the backend database. We can also click on the change report, and that will itemize the changes that have not yet been made. When we hit apply or OK, in this case, I'll just hit apply, those changes will be sent to the backend, and we can see that we're now in sync with the backend database. No changes are uncommitted or outstanding, if you will. There are several settings that affect the user interface and user experience, and we can look at those over here. Some settings are actually hidden because they are not typically needed by the DataHub administrator, so we can show those hidden settings through the view menu. Some of the settings that are most likely going to be changed by the administrator might include things like warn when using the default password. You'll recall that when we started DataHub, it did indicate that the admin account was using the default password, and this warning was going to be checked, or this condition would be checked and would result in a warning. The default principal IP pattern is set here, 0, and we can again see that, for example, there are particular roles that will be automatically used for principal role membership. So a number of different things, including TOTP configuration, etc. When we are working with security, it's a good idea to adhere to security best practices. And the one that we talked about already was changing the default password for the admin account. So I'll do that now. I'm going to change the password to something a bit more cryptic and hit OK on that. And I will apply that change. And you'll notice that when I now reopen or restart the Cogent DataHub UI, I will get back the normal DataHub properties window, but the warning that the password is still the default for the admin account no longer shows up. Other security best practices, we should be using complex passwords. If we, for example, attempt to add an account with a simple password, I'm just going to enter the word test. we will get a warning that indicates this password does not meet the complexity requirements. You'll have the option to proceed anyway. It is generally suggested that you use something that is a bit more cryptic, using uppercase, lowercase, numbers, symbols, etc. It's also a good idea to create purpose-specific user accounts. So, for example, rather than using the John account both as an interactive user as well as something that perhaps might be used in a data source application, for example, connecting via the Cogent DataHub ETK and a field device, it's a good idea to create a different account for that. For interactive accounts, we encourage the use of multi-factor authentication, for example, in addition to password, using something like TOTP, also creating context-specific connection principles. We've talked about that before, how we can use different interface or protocol connection requirements and/or different IP patterns to match. Restricting the rules that limit user permissions that are only required, and again, creating and using roles with restricted data domains. That ends this video. In other videos, we'll do things like practice configuring TOTP authentication, as well as configuring custom data permissions and importing accounts from a Windows local machine and an LDAP server. Thank you.